Hey, how you doing? So today we're talking about the forgotten art of writing bad poetry, especially one that makes you physically cringe. And let me get this started on a very light-hearted article I found. It's called Why Everyone Should Be Writing Bad Poetry by Alison Schneider from 2023. And they're basically talking about how it's all around us. And when you write poetry, it's written for your eyes only, so there's basically no pressure. And you write to express, not to impress. That is, you can write to journal. Also enhance your vocabulary in the process because you're going to look up words to be like kind of specific about how you feel. And the last point, make poetry cool again. This is the main emphasis of this video too. That I really want to make poetry cool again. I want to go back to my 2016 Tumblr poet girl era. Scroll through Tumblr looking at anonymous people writing poetry, which is exactly what I'm talking about in my second article that I found. It's called Rupi Kaur and the Rise of Tumblr Poetry. Does using line breaks make you a poet? This is like a discussion forum. People are really mean on here because people are really mean when it comes to Rupi Kaur anyways. I mean, we all used to love Rupi Kaur at one point. In 2016, I think, was the time when there was the release of Milk and Honey, the book by Rupi Kaur, and everybody just like happened to love it. And then suddenly people were like, oh, you can't just do line breaks and call it free verse. And so everybody was just annoyed by Rupi Kaur all of a sudden. And now in this particular discussion board, they're comparing Rupi Kaur's writing style of poetry with E.E. Cummings, and they're trying to rationalize how one is like lesser real poetry and the other is more poetry, which I think is kind of stupid because all poetry is poetry. I found another article on Tumblr. It's called Objects of Permanence or What Was Tumblr Poetry by Emily Palermo, and they're talking about a lot of different things. First off, they have mentioned that Emily, the writer of this essay, was like a writer of a collection of poems posted to Tumblr from 2013 2018, and they actually ran into like one of the people who had read it from back in the day, and they came up to them asking, are you the Emily Palermo? And they just went like, what do you mean? Brought up that they used to like read their stuff on Tumblr, which I think is really sweet. In this article, they're basically like talking about their perspective of having been famous on Tumblr back in the day when that was all the hype. And they've mentioned this one paragraph which summarizes the entire point that I'm trying to emphasize, that poetry cannot inherently be bad. And they've said, I am resisting the version of this essay where I denigrate the things that I wrote as a teenager as bad poetry, thinking about them in the ways that we recall our diary entries from middle school or those shitty novels we secretly love. And that may be the easier essay to write, one that's full of self-deprecation and pokes fun at tried metaphors and expected motifs. But I am uninterested in shame, and having now been forced to reflect on that 5-year span, I actually find there are far more interesting things to consider beyond disavowal. There's no point in being ashamed of having done something when you were a teenager, especially. And this also reminds me of that one video by Anna Howard in their podcast Wild Geese, when they were talking about, I don't want clean hands, I want hands that can help people. And that entire quote was one that I had up on my wall like a few months ago when I was living in another country. And I think that also brings back to that quote, because when you write bad poetry and when you share bad art with the world, it tells people that it is a comfortable space. Like you have free will, and you can like inherently just do anything that you want to do, and you can share anything creative with the world, because nothing creative is ever objectively good or bad or can be judged. Okay, I'm gonna put a pin in this and I'm gonna return back to this topic if it is objectively good or bad. In this article, they're also talking about like Insta poetry and a particular style of online poem that has been largely and controversially popularized by Rupi Kaur, who has been named Instagram's favorite poet. This thing also kind of pissed me off until they mentioned a Tumblr book, which is so cool. By the way, I opened its PDF, and the front page of that, it's called Chapter 1, You Must Be New Here, an Introduction, and that's the Willy Wonka meme that cracked me up. And this book basically talks about like the design history and cultures on Tumblr, and it's very critical to Tumblr, which I was not expecting looking at like by the face of it. It happens to be very critical of how and like what all was going on back in the day. And even now, this essay has also mentioned that everything in the world is mortal except fame on Tumblr, which is so fascinating. And another paragraph says now our feeds flood with AI content and targeted misinformation. Social media CEOs act as gleeful participants in the rise of global fascism and repression of marginalized voices. I'm thinking back to an internet experience that I am not certain could exist now, remembering the digital spaces and communities that we could create for ourselves, the global connections that we could cultivate, and collective experiences with language that we shared. This is that author basically reminiscing and how that might not ever be the same again. Okay, so now why was it forgotten? I could come up with 4 reasons basically. The first, short form content led to a shorter attention span, led to people not being able to read, which led to people not having any inspiration to write. Second point, too much content, so people became more picky about the content that they saw and everything became cringe. Third point, increased stress led to doom scrolling, which led to overstimulation and emotional reliance on instant dopamine, which led to no thoughts or emotions. And it continued, and that led to more stress and doom scrolling and overstimulation, and the cycle goes on. And fourth cycle was no solitude equals no creativity. This was basically something I saw in a YouTube video recently. This is a TED talk by Daniel. It's called Your Brain is Smarter Than You Think. This is actually a lawyer talking about the neuroscience of how creativity helps our neural connections strengthen. One of the things they mentioned was that creativity is fostered through solitude and being alone. So now why do we need it back? My first very important point is neuroscience and how research backs up creativity and brain health. First article I found was actually a discussion. In one of the paragraphs, they were talking about performance of poetry, and they said, in real time, while you're really there, that's experientially very present. What a lot of poets do, particularly when they're writing for performance, is to capture elements, the text, the repetition, the ums of that experience overtly, and play with all the things together. It's not as simple as saying they're playing with sounds, but those elements are there in the sound. That's basically why essentially any art cannot be objectively stated as also as good or bad, because it is like a combination of the elements together, and any creative performance especially cannot be judged through an objective lens. The next article I found was actually a research paper by Dahila Zaidel from 2014. It's called Creativity, Brain and Art, Biological and Neurological Considerations. And they're talking about how turning to communication through art in lieu of language deficits reflects a biological surviving strategy, which I think is so interesting, because when we think about anything creative, and especially poetry and language, we think about preserving our language and preserving our culture, but we never think about a biological surviving strategy, because as humans we require language to communicate with each other. And even though we have separated and divided our own communities with this idea that we speak a certain language that somebody else does not, it is essentially still our sole biologically surviving strategy. This was the article where they were trying to figure out why a lot of famous artists have a lot of mental disorders, including neurodegenerative brain diseases, and how if it's related to their artistic depictions and their imagination. However, they couldn't really figure out why and how that goes on, because it's too complex to actually fractionize and measure. The next was a paper called Something Else, Then Something Else Again, Neuroscience and Connection Making in Contemporary Poetry. I think this is a thesis which is talking about self-identifying as an avant-garde poet was particularly associated with both positive schizotypy and bipolar symptoms. Stay with me. Genuine neurological disease does not assist creativity. Rather, if creativity and psychosis are connected, it is more likely to be revealed not as a function of the psychotic state itself, but in more subtle ways. For example, through certain modes or forms of thinking in which the tendencies to psychosis and creativity might prove to have in common. This is by Claridge, Brewer, and Watkins from 1990. This might be inferred from the diagnosis from the poems that they write, which I don't think is fair, because people can write about something that they have imagined, somebody else's shoes that they've put themselves into to write that poem. And if you infer a diagnosis from that poem, it's not really fair to say that, oh, this person has this problem or issue or whatever. They've also mentioned, though not related to mental illness, a suggested link exists between synesthesia and poets' accounts of tendencies in their work. Yet here is Wolf. He rustles in the night, only in the wind, but you switch on the light, said Burnside in 1988, here the wolf might seem to be a symbol or emblem of the apophenic tendency, a thing conjured from nothing, which has the power to terrify all the same. It is imagination itself that is the fearful thing. So here they're talking about apophenia, which is like a tendency to perceive meaningful connections between unrelated things, according to Wikipedia. How they've mentioned the wolf who rustles in the night, which might just be a symbol of this tendency because it's just something that is seemingly terrifying. Another thing that they've touched on is the illusion of free will when one partakes into a creative process of writing. Libet et al. Are not arguing that we don't have free will, but rather pointing to a discrepancy between our subjective understanding of intention and the objective reality signified by the readiness potential. Their work gestured towards an unexplained gap between physical and subjective phenomena, a gap which is also preoccupied by John Burnside. And Burnside in Guardian in 2002 mentioned, "What ails me is a whole set of different, though intimately related nostalgias that, like the various symptoms of a rare disease, point to what is lacking in my day-to-day subsistence as a slightly askew inhabitant of the social realm. One of these symptoms is nostalgia for the present, the feeling that as I experience the moments of the day, I am always being distracted or interrupted, so that the majority of these moments never entirely unfold or cohere without being properly savored." What the writers have inferred from this is that the nostalgias that are seemingly like symptoms of a rare disease for them is kind of a disjuncture between what we do and what we consciously experience, and the attempt to trying to putting it all into words is why they feel in this way, which might be an illusion of free will. Stick with me. Inverse relationship between cortical thickness and the creativity measures in the present study speak to the possible importance of efficient information flow among brain areas. The generation of novel original ideas is associated with less cortical thickness within frontal and posterior cortical regions, requiring higher function activation to initiate cognitive control. Young et al. 2010. This is essentially what they are talking about in neuroscience words, mentioning that there requires a higher IQ, free association, and spontaneous flow state to actually partake in any creative process. And when anybody partakes in such said creative process, say writing a poem, they are indulging in a higher IQ activity with like activating their free association of the brain, and they are activating their own flow state. Jumping on to our next research paper. This is written by Frederick Turner and Ernst Poppel from 1983. Essentially what they're talking about is poetic meter, which is the basic rhythmic structure of a line or a verse, saying by means of metrical variation, physical and pictorial powers of the right brain are enlisted by meter to cooperate with the linguistic powers of the left, and by auditory driving effects, the lower levels of the nervous system are stimulated in such a way as to reinforce the cognitive functions of the poem, to improve memory, and to promote physiological and social harmony. Metered poetry may also play an important part in developing more subtle understandings of time, and may thus act as a technique to concentrate and reinforce our uniquely human tendency to make sense of the world in terms of values like truth, beauty, and goodness. This is why we should all be writing poetry. This is exactly why. That's all I need to say. Okay, so the next paper I found takes a little different take on all this about poetry in terms of like talking therapies, free voicing, and mirror neuron connections. I mentioned both poetry and free voicing have the capability to connect us to lower levels of deeper emotional or even instinctual feeling. When people write or read poetry, the sensory effects of the images, metaphors, rhythm, sound, and shape may connect them to new body awareness. Allowing our voices to come up in sounds or in words can enable us to come to home to our bodies. They're basically talking about like the core support poetry and voicing in the context of a world that is demanding and overstimulating and very fast-paced. This is from an article written by Christina Chauvel called Poetry, Voice, Brain, and Body. The next thing I want to jump into is a little more technical. The art, beauty, and truth. The psychosocial genomics of consciousness, dreams, and brain growth in psychotherapy and mind-body healing. Stay with me, it's not that complicated. It's written by Ernst Lawrence Rossi from 2004. What they're basically talking about is that when an individual engages with novelty or intense emotional experiences, the immediate-early genes, IEGs, are often activated within minutes to hours, initiating a cascade of genetic activity, which is tracked using microarrays and neurostem chips. I don't know how they've written this in 2004, and I'm not sure how much I trust this paper because this is what it looks like. It's too colorful. I'm sorry. I really appreciate whoever came up with this graphic designing of this paper, but I'm kind of cynical about that. I'm sorry. They're talking about how technology is developed to measure those immediate early gene changes that are activated while one partakes in a creative process. Now we jump into another really important bit of this video, which is the political implications of true free expression. And the first paper is by Faulkner 2017, which is probably one of my favorite papers I read for this video. And they're talking about poetry as political, as a feminist practice, as social research, and autoethnography, as a personal that becomes universal, and as visionary activism. One of their own pieces called The Personalist Poetry. The piece is called The Interview and it's written for Sylvia Plath after The Applicant. I'm going to recite it to you because I loved it so much. Can you separate lights from darks? Gabardine from linen, too much bother, I cannot care. If your hands are warm like Georgia hot springs, capable of sparing my feet, the Sisyphean walk over broken crayons and wine glass, the laundry room of dog and dust. Do you know how to make coffee? Float a river of cream in my capacious cup. Forget the sugar and call my name with an accent of Deutsch, but speak only ein bisschen. Patch the noise of domestic bliss with a steady pour and 2 clings suffice. Will you wait for the repairs? Bury the hamster with the holly. Blanket behind the dying holly. Never mind if you dig too shallow. I want a wife too. Isn't it beautiful? Now I want to jump on to another paper I found. Talked about activating politics with poetry and spoken word. Valerie Shep talked about how spoken word poetry has been found in a lot of political activism. And they've mentioned this one TED talk called The Danger of Silence by Clint Smith, where Clint Smith basically recites a poem. There was one of the paragraphs that really touched me and I want to recite it to you. We spend so much time listening to the things that people are saying that we really pay attention to the things they don't. Silence is the residue of fear. It is feeling your flaws, gut-wrenching guillotine in your tongue. It is the air retreating from your chest because it doesn't feel safe in your lungs. Silence is Rwandan genocide. Silence is Hurricane Katrina. It is what you hear when there aren't enough body bags left. It is a sound after the news is already died. It is jarring. It is chains. It is privilege. It is pain. There is no time to pick your battles when your battles have already picked you. There is a lot more to this poem, and I think it is absolutely beautiful. The next article I found is called For Their Fights Affect Our Fights. It's on the impact of African American poetics and politics on the poetry of Lionel Fogarty, which reminded me of the correlation of Hindi and Urdu poetry, how that poetry impacted and sustained our language in the face of national struggles, especially when India was colonized by the British back in the day. Language played a very important role because it was like a one source through which Indians could communicate with each other without British having to understand them. Now we jump on to queer and LGBTQ plus IA topics and how poetry plays a very important role in that too. Who's surprised? This one paper by Jen Ping and Naifel talks about reticent poetics and queer poetics, and they've analyzed like personhood and navigation of a homosexual person through homophobia in Taiwan. It's an analysis of a contemporary novel of queer desire called The Unfilial Daughter, may be read as both representing and complicit with such reticent or understated aesthetic and political powers, which I think is really interesting because in any culture that you go in, there is always some kind of personal differences that people hold against each other in that same culture, but those are not any kind of differences that you would not see also existing in an other culture. And if you think about it, it's just like we're all humans and we're all basically living the same lives. There is no unique experience. There's a Reddit thread that exists for every single problem in your life. Jumping on to Liberation's Love Language, the Politics and Poetics of Queer Translation After Stonewall, which is talking about a lot of important things, but this one thing that really caught my eye was the poem called A Woman is Talking to Death, a 1974 poem by American author and activist Judy Grant as a stance against death, and it celebrated the resilience of queer and working class communities, which is so impactful and so important, especially in times of struggle. Taking a step back to a very light-hearted article again. I don't know how much you might relate to me right now, but it's written by Ash David Jane, who was the ADJ on Tumblr. I have read so many poems on Tumblr back in the day written by ADJ that this is unreal. And this article is written in 2022 called The Golden Age of Online Poetry by Ash David Jane. They're talking about how until 2015 there was the golden age of Tumblr and the most gilded of all were the poets. They've actually mentioned one of the book deals they found through that fame and how immortality of Tumblr fame still persists. Jumping on to one of the major issues when you are indulging in writing poetry is the cringe factor, which is also the name of a chapter written by Laura Kippens, and they're talking about how the cringe might be rooted in self-preservation and ego instincts. This is an idea that really caught my eye until they connected it to Freudian ideas of consciousness and how it is connected to sublimation and other sexual desires. Except that if it's self-preservation and ego instincts, yeah, of course, I am trying to preserve my self-worth. I'm not trying to be cringe on the internet because already there is so much pressure to be perfect on social media that you can't really expect anyone to come up here and just like speak out their shitty poetry. But that is exactly why it is so important. That is exactly why you need to be free, you need to be cringe. The next paper is written by Schwan Beck from 2021 and talk about the catharticism of the cringe. In a similar way, it might not be caging as we might look at it. Like, it can just be freeing if we just accept the cringe and we just like express ourselves freely and truly in the face of an audience. I think it really comes back to that one idea that people talk about, like the kind of comfort and trust you'll build with people by embarrassing yourself in front of them is not one that you can build in any other way. In the context of cringe, like if you are that inherently free in front of people and you can express yourself as freely as possible, then you can truly connect with people in a way that you might not be able to in any other way. So my last topic is obviously AI, because when have I ever recorded a video where I've not talked about AI? This is exhausting. One paper I found, Poetry Will Not Optimize or What is Literature to AI, which I found, I'm kind of cynical about it because they are really confident that poetry cannot be optimized through AI, and they've mentioned that claims that AI systems automate and expedite creativity reflect industry and research priorities of speed, scale, optimization, and frictionless, driving much artificial intelligence design and application. But poetry will not optimize. The creative process cannot be reduced to a prompt. And they tested this whole thing by a transformer AI poetry classics as reimagined and rewritten by an artificial intelligence. A GPT-3 adaptation of Maya Angelou's famous 1978 poem Still I Rise. It takes the opening 4 lines as prompts and then regenerates texts that putatively extend in style and content. The real challenge perhaps is AI has an ability to account for representation itself, deciding how if to orthographically represent actual speech, indexes, social more than sonic realities. Now my question here to all of this is that if somebody is aware of the histories and social and sonic realities but is not a linguist, is a human, and is not aware of or has any knowledge of dialectical and or phonetical representation, would it still be considered more poetic than AI? Would any bad poem be considered more poetic than AI is my question. And this research claims to measure that yes, it is. Essentially, they are saying that, but it just can't really be said because it can't really be reduced to a one-line sentence. It is more complex than that. That also reminds me that how no machine to determine if any sentence is objectively good or bad was mentioned in a video by the channel Below the Fray, where they were talking about how the author's intent and creativity is way too complex to be objectively measured in any way. So if you bring it down to measuring one single sentence as being objectively good or bad, it's technically just not possible. Okay, so I found another paper talking about intervention in writer's block. It's called A Machine in the Loop by Iona Gilbert from 2023. It is a very useful research. So they researched if it was actually helpful for writers to use AI to get a push away from the writer's block. And what they found was that writing with AI is seen to mimic peculiarities of creative writing that include projecting one's inner voice and seeking a false self. In the example of Adaptation 2002, one ultimately comes to appreciate too that suffering through a block unaided can propel a writer to make bold decisions to test the limits of human creativity. So they did find out eventually that it is not reliable or sustainable, and it requires the writer to deal with the block themselves to actually cope and actually build their own originality in their work. Okay, so I obviously had 5 more papers that I couldn't go through with, but I found this one Instagram reel was talking about how Substack is not the same. Why not Substack? It's because it's become this one whole clickbait, especially with Charlie XCX coming up on Substack recently. It's just become a marketing game and it defeats the purpose. It holds no value anymore. I'm not saying that art loses its value when it is monetized, because artists deserve to be paid. I'm just saying that when art is monetized to such an extent that its entire purpose is serving the subject, that is this one person who might click on this video if this has this one clickbaity title, because an art is something that is connected to the writer. And when I lose that authority with myself, when I place that entire purpose of writing, what I am writing, to be the screen time of the reader, and I as a writer am just failing to perform in a way that I am supposed to perform, at least according to me. Okay, so just to summarize that, so we've not lost the plot here. Why should we be writing bad poetry? 1, we need to practice the art of surrendering perfection and accuracy. 2nd, we need to kill the part of you that cringes, not the part of you that is cringe. This is what will make you ultimately free, because Albert Camus said that the only way to deal with an unfree world is to become so absolutely free that your very existence is an act of rebellion. 3rd, self-reflection and self-awareness fosters self-regulation. And if you keep judging yourself and you keep hiding away from what you truly feel and what you truly want to express, you will never be able to self-regulate your own emotions. 4th, let yourself be boring and slow, especially in an overstimulating and fast-paced world, being calm enough to handle difficult situations. My last point is to take a step back and question what the damn point of it all is. Okay, this is all I have for you today. I'm sorry if this video has gone longer than usual and I yapped about too many papers, because I ended up looking up too many stuff online, and I found too much stuff online. If you're interested and you're still around, I would like to end this with something that I wrote recently. So here it goes. Take off all those bracelets and all those rings. I'm wearing a long yellow skirt and dreaming of this. Follow your heart, or other such things, echoing like a forgotten prayer under unmoisturized skin, like a coloring book made specifically for adults, or a knife that always cuts, a thread that ties only the ends of every definition of you, or an insult that pierces right through. What does any of this mean? I've been learning to not leave without saying goodbye, because space can be imagined, real, hurtful, or undefined. There are so many hearts. Which one is the right one to seek? My long skirt used to be shorter and probably red or green. Those bracelets and those rings were made of unbreakable things. So now I pretend. Coloring never had an age. The knives are not that sharp. The threads that tie us are not strong enough. And no insult leaves a mark. Space out and see. Everything so close is so far apart. I used to be naive and I remembered. Now the prayers only chant of words which say, follow your heart, follow your heart, follow your heart. That's all I have for you today. I'll see you.